So let's talk about dependency injection. In our controller itself, we're using this repository and context and creating them in order to get our data. But we'd like to have a way to take these sorts of services and supply them to the controllers, because there's going to be a number of different kinds of services that we're going to need through the process of building our API, and dependency injection can simplify this quite a lot. The trick here is we would like to be able to, when we construct the new foods controller, and I use the CTOR shortcut to create a constructor, we'd like to be able to specify that we want a repository, and more importantly, that we actually want an interface to the repository. The reason for this is simple. We want to use the interface so that when we write tests against these controllers, that we don't have to specify the actual counting case repository. It allows us to be more decoupled with the actual repository we're working with. And it also means that later down the road, if you have some clients using certain data in certain ways, you can actually swap these out depending on which clients need what. But in our case, we really want to use it mostly to abstract it out for testing. We also don't want to care what the repository needs to fulfill its work. The fact that we're passing in a context as well means that we're further complicating this controller by having to have the knowledge that the repository requires a context object. So the trick here is we're going to go ahead and create a new local variable called underscore repo that we're going to use for all of our different methods. So we're going to be passed in a repository and then use it for whatever methods we're going to expose on this controller. I'm going to use the little shortcut to just create a field stub for me for our repository. So now that we have the foods controller, and we're expecting it to be passed in, if we go ahead and look at our API call for foods again, we're going to run into an error pretty quickly. And this error is that the controller itself doesn't have a parameterless public constructor. The default in Web API is that all of these controllers have to have no input parameters at all. We're going to change this by allowing a dependency injection container. We're going to show you using ninject, but you can use any of the others out there, structure map, Unity, whatever inversion of control or IOC container you want to use is valid here. I'm just going to show you ninject because it is one that I'm comfortable and does the job pretty easily. So the job of ninject is going to be to pass in these dependencies into the controller as necessary. We do this by simply going back to NuGet, and we're going to look for a package called ninject MVC3. Now that's a little confusing because this was actually written for MVC3, but it continues to work for MVC4. I have the secret wish that they would just call this ninject.asp.net MVC3, but be that as it may, it's a pretty solid package that hasn't needed to have many changes, so I'm just going to go ahead and add it in. And this is going to add a new class into our app start called ninject web common. This is a startup bootstrap, if you want to think about it that way. This is simply something that when the web server comes up and gets started is going to do its own registration. At the bottom of this new class is going to be a special method called register services. And this is where you're actually going to add code to register the type of services you want the dependency injection layer to be able to pass through to any object that needs it, most notably controllers. We can do this by using this kernel object that is being passed in, and we can say bind, and then pass it in the interface we're interested in. In this case, it's going to be the counting case repository, and we're going to bind it to counting case repository. So we're essentially telling the container here, when someone requests this, give them an instance of this, and if you have to, go ahead and create a new instance of the counting case repository and pass it through to them. Now we have a problem here because we've registered this counting case repository, but you and I have already seen that it requires a context object to be passed in. And so in that same way, we also want to bind that when someone asks for this context object, to bind it to an instance of that object as well. Notice we're not using an interface because the context itself doesn't have an abstraction to the interface. Not all implementations of the repository will require a context, so maybe this won't be necessary. But one of the magic things about dependency injection is that when we ask for something like the counting case repository, like we've done in the constructor, it's going to look through this list and go, oh, they want this, therefore I need to give them a new instance of this class. I can do that, but wait, there isn't an empty constructor here. Let me look at the constructor and what its input parameters are. They need a counting k context. Let me see if I know about that as well. Oh, I do. I'll just go ahead and create it to pass into the instance of counting k repository so that I can then fulfill the request to passing in the repository to the controller itself. So it's going to handle those interdependencies, even as they change, without us having to have the controller accept a context object and a repository, and maybe later there might be a logging component, or there might be a mail component, or any other sorts of different components that the repository needs. At this point, we only know that we need this, and we're going to let the inject system handle the rest of the dependency management for the other objects that are related there. And right now, if we were doing simple ASP.NET MVC, this would just work. The inject itself knows about it, but if we go back to the browser and refresh, we're going to actually get the same error. That's weird. Why are we getting the same error? The reason is that ninject doesn't know about Web API out of the box. So if we look at the ninject here, we'll actually see that it's going to know about HTTP applications. And so because of that, it's being grandfathered into being able to be used in MVC controllers, but not Web API controllers. So we have to make one other small change here. We need to support Web API. This requires one additional package. Let's go back to NuGet. This time we're going to look for Web API contrib ioc.ninject. This is a special project out of an open source project called Web API contrib, which is a set of tools that can be used with Web API. There's a bunch of little utilities that are in Web API contrib that can help you build Web API components. And in this case, it has support for an inject and the IOC container. So let's go ahead and add it. It's a nice quick install. And then here, we're going to go to the global configuration, which is part of Web API, and look for the dependency resolver inside Web API. This is the thing that knows how to handle dependency injection in Web API itself. And we're going to use as the dependency resolver a new instance of this class called the ninject resolver. We add that namespace, and we're going to pass it in our kernel object, the object that we can use to do these resolutions to dependencies. By adding this magic line into our project to support Web API, our APIs will now work again. So that we're going to enable ourselves to use the dependency injection to handle the requirements for certain kinds of objects we'll need. And we're going to need more than just the repository. Later on, we're going to introduce some different ones like security, libraries, and things like that we're going to need in Web API. And this will set us up with that standard framework that we need to handle the dependency resolution. Now let's talk about the real objects we're going to return from our APIs.